Today, a short presentation on the Gospels and the Resurrection and surprising turns in recent scholarship. This is just a kind of a summary of some information in this book by Robert J. Hutchinson, Searching for Jesus. New discoveries in the quest for Jesus of Nazareth and how they confirm the Gospel accounts. In it, he states what secular Jewish and not necessarily Christian scholars and archaeologists are discovering and concluding, and how their recent research is, to a surprising degree, supporting much of what the Gospels say about Jesus of Nazareth. Dramatically at odds with the skeptical theories I was taught in college and then in graduate school, even more startling to me was the fact that these newer conclusions were often not showing up in the media, even though in many cases they were being proposed by secular experts at top universities. Many of the shocking and new discoveries you read about in weekly news magazines every Easter season are products of the first rationalistic quest, and thus are 150 years old. So, do the Gospels contain eyewitness testimony? And for decades, it's been claimed that John's Gospel has a high Christology, a higher view of Christ, a view of Christ as divine, as opposed to supposedly earlier and more primitive views of the other Gospels. For 100 years, really, critical scholars insisted it must be written very late because of this high Christology, early 2nd century, theological rather than historical, basically made up to present a theological message. Yet, for example, we read in John 5, verses 2 to 10, about a miracle that Jesus performs, and a reference to this pool of Bethesda. And this is only one of many instances in the Gospel of John where you have accurate historical details not found in any other sources. So, as Hutchinson writes, even many non-Christians, including Israeli archaeologists and Jewish scholars, now concede that the Gospels likely contain information that could only have come from eyewitness observers. And there's another book dedicated to this topic I highly recommend by Richard Bauckham, who goes through the Gospels in a very detailed fashion, arguing that the Gospels give us many clues that their accounts are based on eyewitness testimony. And as just one example, we might have wondered why, when we read the account of Simon of Cyrene helping Jesus to carry the cross, why does this say that he is the father of Alexander and Rufus? I mean, who are these guys? Why are they named in the Gospels specifically? And Bauckham argues that it's because they were still alive during the time the Gospels were being circulated and could serve as primary eyewitnesses. Just one of many examples. He notes that there are two Bart Ehrmans, apparently. As you might know, Bart Ehrman is a very famous atheist who claims he converted to atheism because of his studies in New Testament, textual criticism. So one of his popular level books, sold to the general public, he says things like this: these New Testament copies, just copies of the manuscripts, the Gospels, the letters of Paul, whatever, differ from one another in so many places that we don't even know how many differences there are. You might have heard this in different forms, but kind of the same sentiment from other people. But elsewhere, Ehrman writes, the vast majority of these mistakes are completely insignificant, showing us nothing more than that scribes in antiquity could spell no better than most people today. What he means is that most of the errors are things like spelling errors or spelling variations that don't make any difference to what Christians believe. In one of his textbooks, he says, He actually says this: we can reconstruct the original words of the New Testament with reasonable, although not probably 100% accuracy. And that's the same, he's saying the same thing as many world-renowned textual critics, including atheists. Okay, so let's get this straight. It's not just Christians who are claiming this crazy thing. Even non-Christians are admitting this fact. Ehrman says one thing in his scholarly, peer-reviewed works when he knows his academic reputation is on the line, and he says something completely different in his popular bestsellers. Why? Well, all this is good timing in terms of what archaeology is discovering, just as a new generation of mythicists has shown up to claim that the entire New Testament is a work of fiction. Archaeologists are now providing substantial evidence of just the opposite. Good timing. As an example, in 2009, we had a discovery of a large first-century synagogue in Magdala, and Israeli archaeologists say they're almost certain that Jesus preached here in this very synagogue. Was that in the news in 2009? Motive for murder. Excavations reveal luxurious palaces of the priestly aristocracy, the Sadducees. And you remember them from the Gospels as opponents of Jesus. One house was 10,000 square feet covered with marble slabs. Recent scholarship suggests Jesus' beef was with the crushing double taxation of fees and surcharges from the temple aristocracy and the Romans. And Jesus' actions threatened the flow of millions of silver shekels to this aristocracy. Motive enough for murder. Looking at the minimal facts that point to the resurrection: the empty tomb, number one, and number two, the disciples having experiences which convinced them Jesus had risen, and who finally gave their lives for this belief. These two minimal facts beg for an explanation, and the best explanation to date is the resurrection. Contrary to what Jesus experts have said for more than 100 years, belief in Jesus as God arose almost immediately, within a year or two after his death. This belief is found in the earliest Christian documents. For example, 1 Corinthians 8, verse 6, written around AD 55. Philippians 2, verses 6 to 11, which is a Christian creed from the 40s. In 1 Corinthians, we read this: "For us there is one God the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist." And in Philippians, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness. So already here, a very high Christology. And according to Hurtado, here's the clincher. It says, what is no parallel is the devotional practices in evidence throughout the early strata of the New Testament, such as singing hymns about Jesus, the invocation of Jesus, prayers offered through Jesus or in his name, the use of his name in baptism, prophecy uttered in his name, and more. These practices, both individually and collectively, are without precedent or parallel in Roman-era circles of Jews. Nevertheless, the evidence shows they arose among Jewish circles in the earliest years of the Christian movement. And this is much too soon to be due to evolutionary or pagan influence. Much too early. What is the best explanation? Something momentous happened that convinced people in a fiercely monotheistic society that God had visited them in the person of Jesus Christ. And this remains the best explanation historically of his death, the empty tomb, and the appearances to the disciples. Hope this was interesting or helpful to you, and I'll see you in the next video.